Good afternoon, and welcome to the inaugural Banks-McKelvey Memorial Lecture. My name is Phil Hoffman. This new lecture series honors the research and teaching of two Caltech colleagues we lost prematurely in 2000 and 2002. Jeffrey S. Banks, who got his PhD in social science in Caltech in 1986, made important contributions to game theory and the politics of voting. Richard D. McKelvey, Banks' advisor, was a pioneer in just about every field of political science, including developing statistical methods for analyzing voting, mathematical models of voting participation, and key contributions to game theory. And this lecture series is made possible by a gift of endowment from Howard E. Jessen, a Caltech graduate in the class of 1946. Probably no one is better suited to give the inaugural Banks-McKelvey Memorial Lecture than our speaker this afternoon, Gary Cox. He's a Caltech graduate with a bachelor's degree in history in 1978 and a social science PhD in 1982. He co-authored one paper with McKelvey, and he too is a distinguished social scientist, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the National Academy of Sciences. And like Banks and McKelvey, he's done pioneering research in many fields of political science, particularly in the area of legislative and electoral politics. Recently, he's turned his attention to one of the great mysteries of economic growth, explaining why Britain industrialized before any other country. Modern economic growth began there in the 1700s, spread in the 1800s to Western Europe, the US, Canada, and eventually Japan. The rest of the world was left far behind for decades. Part of the explanation for this great divergence in economic growth rates lies with the precocious institutional advantages Britain achieved in the late 1600s and the 1700s, as Gary has shown in his wonderful book, Marketing Sovereign Promises. But part of the explanation stems from an interaction between the human capital of skilled labor and urbanization that was peculiar to Europe. That is the subject of his talk today: assortative matching, innovation rates, and the Great Divergence. I'm sure Gary's talk will prompt questions, so please enter them in the Q&A below. So let's all welcome Gary Cox.
Okay, thanks, Phil. I'm very happy to be giving this inaugural lecture since I knew both Jeff and Dick well and learned an immense amount from their scholarship. The paper I'm presenting today, I will share my screen here. Okay, so this paper is joint with Valentin Figueroa, who's virtually in attendance today. And it deals, as Phil noted, with this puzzle of the Great Divergence. Why did Europe, which around 1000 AD was a peripheral part of Eurasia, 500 or 800 years later, emerge as a economic powerhouse? So following a long line of research, our premise in this work is that technological change is the main driver of modern economic growth, or Schumpeterian growth. And so we'll start with a question of what drove this innovation process in the West. And our answer has three main steps. First, the proliferation of communes or self-governing cities in Western Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries creates a more competitive labor market, or a set of regional competitive labor markets that are pretty distinctive on a Eurasian context. And I'll get back to that in a little bit. Second, these more competitive labor markets spark what we'll call Kremerian development. This is based on Kremer's O-ring model of development. And what we mean by that in particular is that there's a unique amount of assortative matching of skilled labor across cities, which leads to the emergence of what we call apex cities, think Silicon Valley. And then Kremerian development, once it starts in the West and deepens, profoundly affects O-ring sectors, leading to divergent innovation rates. And that happens not just between Western Europe and the rest of Eurasia, but between particular parts of Western Europe and the rest. So the plan of the argument and evidence that I'll run through is to first recap Kremer's model, then provide some evidence that assortative matching did indeed surge in Western Europe after the communal revolution and had both of the sort of welfare effects that Kremer's model highlights, namely productivity and inequality effects, and then largely remained negligible elsewhere in Eurasia over the time period that we're looking at it, which is 1000 to 1800. Then I'll turn to evidence that apex cities, high-tech, high-wage, high-growth cities do appear in Western Europe after 1200. They're absent before that. They do drive innovation, especially in O-ring sectors, and they're fairly scarce in the rest of Eurasia. Where you do get cities that are similar, they're usually produced by imperial patronage and die as soon as the patron dies. Then I'll turn to evidence specifically on innovation rates. This is from Joseph Needham and other compilers of innovation events, and show that these are high in those parts of Western Europe that are rich in apex cities and low in the rest of Europe and Eurasia, where apex cities are pretty scarce. So here's the couple of slides on Kremer's model. He's assuming that there's a population of firms that offer wages to workers who have varying skill levels, and all of this is occurring in a competitive labor market. Production has this particular O-ring form, which is shown there on the second line. Y is output. There's some capital input, and the QJs are the qualities with which various tasks in the production process are performed. So one can think of this as the probability that the worker undertaking task J performs it perfectly. And B is the output per worker when all tasks are completed perfectly. As you can see, if you throw in a single dud worker in this process, you zero out the output. So a key conceptual assumption in Kremer's model is that you can't substitute quantity for quality. No amount of my effort in the kitchen will produce a meal as good as 1 hour of my wife's effort. So Kremer has a fair number of predictions. The ones that are most relevant for us is that the model predicts assortative matching in equilibrium, which means that each of these cities is going to match the quality of the workers across tasks. You can break this down from the city level to guild or a lower level, and it wouldn't particularly change our analysis. Another feature that emerges from Kremer's model is stratification. There's going to be a top city in each O-ring sector that has all the best workers. The second city will have the second best workers, and so forth. We'll go on down, and that process of urban stratification is going to have both an efficiency consequence. System-wide output will be maximized when there's perfect assortative matching and stratification, and inequality. As Kremer puts it, wage and productivity differentials between rich and poor countries are enormous and persistent. So there's some scope conditions. Kremer's model is pretty prominent in the modern literature, but obviously to apply it to earlier centuries requires that the model is approximately applicable. So there's two main scope conditions that we highlight in the paper. You can really only expect this kind of Kremerian development and apex city emergence if you've got competitive labor markets, at least regionally, and you have O-ring sectors of some kind. So back to this notion of the communal revolution, creating more competitive labor markets, that occurred on both sides of the market. So a stylized picture of the labor market prior to the communal revolution is that the main demanders of labor are a bunch of noble landowners, and their preference for the supply side of the market is serfdom and slavery. When the self-governing towns emerge, the merchants who run those towns are in a position to compete for labor with their erstwhile noble landlords, and they do. They're also interested in the supply side of the market, and so they immediately lobby for policies that erode serfdom. The most famous of these is the notion that a fugitive serf who lives for a year and a day in a town is thereby emancipated. This had a fairly obvious benefit for the towns and an obvious problem from the lords, and the towns, where they were numerous, won the day. So after the communal revolution, in those parts of Western Europe which are most affected by it, you get much larger wage labor markets than was typical beforehand, or than you can find elsewhere in Eurasia. As far as the O-ring sectors go, we focus and give some examples of things like projectile weaponry, mechanization, optics, and the like. So here's a picture of the flow of argument. Again, we have the communal revolution on the left. We get more competitive labor markets. This sparks a process of assortative skill matching and Kremerian development. And then the two main welfare consequences of that lead to the Great Divergence, the maximization of system-wide output, and the Little Divergence within Europe, the urban stratification part. So as far as evidence go, we pick up on an emergent literature that's looking at assortative matching across a wide variety of contexts. In the modern literature, there's a fairly large set of papers that exploits panel data on workers' employment histories, and that finds assortative matching driving productivity and inequality. So the typical approach in these papers is to use the panel data to estimate individual worker fixed effects and estimate individual firm fixed effects. And the evidence for assortative matching is just that the good workers end up at the good firms. We don't have panel data on our sample. What we can do, however, is investigate the migration decisions of famous persons for whom we know a birth and a death location over these H centuries. The logic here is similar to that of an earlier study by Delacroix et al., who look at university professors and the sort of sorting of professors across universities in medieval and early modern Europe. And they do, to some extent, have salary data, but they usually rely on ex post measures of quality, similar to those I'm going to introduce in a bit. And their basic finding is that the best university professors were congregating in the most prestigious universities pretty early after the invention of universities. So we're going to provide some similar results for notable individuals rather than university professors, and major cities rather than prestigious universities. So our data on the people that we're looking at comes from Freebase, which is a Google-owned database and was coded by Sheikh et al. We're going to be looking at all notable individuals born in Europe or the Middle East and North Africa who die between 1000 and 1800 in our initial analyses. And the basic question is going to be, to which cities do these notables tend to migrate in each century? Are they spreading out evenly? Or are they all going to Paris? What's the story? We will restrict attention to notables who do migrate to a city. So in this analysis, it's conditional on ending up in a city, dying within 5 kilometers. And we'll only consider major Christian cities. So the Islamic governed cities are out of our sample. As a practical matter, the only people who make it into our sample are Latin Christians, a few Orthodox Christians, and a few Jews. So we're going to look again at the birth to death migration decisions after applying these restrictions. We have 4,574 notables, choosing among a maximum of 171 cities in a particular century, an average of 159. The basic notion in this part of the analysis is pretty simple. It's we're assuming that these notables move to the city that offers them the highest wage, net of moving costs. So individual J's cost of moving to a particular city, H, we assume just to be proportional to the distance between J's birthplace and the particular city. And then here's the part of the model that reflects wages. And I've put yellow on the parts that are related to skill matching. So if you look at equation 1 there, we have an expected wage or an expected discounted present income that has a skill matching part reflecting individual J's quality, QJ, and J's perception of city H's quality, QJH. So the notion is that a bright young Leonardo da Vinci might think that Vinci was too small and Florence looked a little bit better, and would move to Florence partly for the reason that there were famous people of whom he had heard and with whom he wanted to hobnob. The population part is also in there, and then the distance, the cost there is brought in. So with that as a background, this is just then put into a standard multinomial choice model. Every creative in every century looks across the cities that they might move to, estimates their wage and their cost of moving, and picks the optimum. So how do we measure quality of individuals for purposes of estimation? We pull out a couple of indicators of each individual notable's perceived output. And one component of this is the length and characters of their longest Wikipedia page. And here we look at the English, Dutch, French, German, Italian, and Spanish Wikipedias. And the other factor is the length and characters of their entry Encyclopedia Britannica. Then we just take the percentile rank on the first principal component. So obviously people in 1200 are probably going to have shorter Wikipedia articles than those in 1800. And so in our analyses, we'll try to control for that sort of effect. The city quality is what J thinks of city H, and the basic idea is simply that individual J likes cities that have more and more eminent notables in and around them. Formally, we use a spatial lag of the other famous individuals alive at the time, and all weighted by their quality per the previous slide. So with those operational measures and distance and population, we can estimate these various models. Here are the first three are the multinomial logit versions. And we also run OLS versions in columns 4 and 5. The basic punchline can be seen just by looking at equation 3 or model 3, where you can see that all the coefficients are significant. Working from the bottom up, we see that creative individuals are attracted to larger cities. They don't like traveling. Even the lowest quality creative, somebody who ends up at the 0 of our quality metric, is attracted to cities that have higher levels of creative congregation. And then that effect is significantly stronger for the higher quality individuals. So the highest quality individual is much more attracted to Florence than the lowest quality notable. The results on the previous slide were pooled across the 8 centuries. We also run them century by century and use them to look at how assortative matching evolved over time. So first, we're going to talk about some evidence that migration led to increasing levels of assortative matching over time. And those episodes or increased levels of assortative matching in turn lead to productivity and inequality consequences. So here's the way we think about the contribution of migration to productivity. I'm going to delay for a while looking at the over time evidence on assortative matching. So what we do is we take the multinomial results or the OLS results, and we simply use the estimated equation, counterfactually set birth and death city populations equal and ignore moving costs. And then we try to estimate the following quantity. We want the expected wage of an individual in their city of death. We're going to subtract from that their expected wage in their city of birth. And we're going to normalize the whole thing by the average expected wage and city of death across all notables in that century. The notion is to compare a world in which people did what they actually did to a counterfactual world in which they all moved to the city closest to their place of birth. Would that kind of alternative logic of migration have produced any consequences for these expected wages? And of course, we're going to interpret these wages as proportional to contemporaneous output, and therefore also proportional to our quality measures based on our current perceptions. So here's the result of that counterfactual exercise, which is, by the by, pretty similar to what most of these papers do, albeit with better data. And what we see is that in these first 3 centuries, we're not getting any implied productivity boost due to the migration decisions of these elites. Starting in 1300, however, and moving out to the end of the time period, we're getting a 14 to 28% productivity boost due to the birth to death migration. So as a benchmark to think about the size of that effect, Delacroix et al. In the study mentioned before, looking just at university professors and estimating slightly different maxima there at both agglomeration and sorting benefits. They reckon that those increased total output of European universities by 20 to 25% before the Black Death. A little bit later, a paper by Mitchell, which has somewhat richer data, figures that British and Irish authors were about 12% more productive while residing in London. And then moving to a contemporary study, Wang figures that within firm skill complementarity accounts for 18% of cross-city productivity gaps in contemporary China. So in addition to looking at the productivity effects of birth to death migrations of assortative matching, we want also to look at how it contributes to inequality across the urban system. So here we just use Gini coefficients and a somewhat similar counterfactual comparison. So we compute the Gini coefficient at death, so taking all notables in a given century as being at their observed city of death, and just calculate the Gini coefficient of the distribution of quality across cities. And then we're going to compare that to what the Gini coefficient would have been had everybody just moved to the city closest to their birthplace. And here's what this delta Gini looks like across time with some error bands. We have very little action in 1100 and 1200. We have a significant contribution, but substantively small in 1300 and 1400. And then in the later centuries, starting in 1500, we have substantially larger contributions to the inequality and distribution of these elite workers. So that was Europe. And before looking at the empirics on the rest of Eurasia, I want to recap the argument that there should be less assortative matching outside Western Europe. So main reason for that is that there were less competitive labor markets. To take the extreme case, early modern Russia has 80% of the population in serfed, and it's hard to see how you can get a assortative matching through labor market process going in that kind of context. But more generally, it's not just the Russian Empire. Princely cities in general throughout Eurasia, and those are the only kinds that exist, should have been less able to compete with rulers and nobles for labor. And smaller overall fractions of workers would be freely mobile. There's serfdom quite widely. There's slavery quite widely. Where serfdom and slavery are less prevalent, you have caste systems which restrict mobility. And then there are household registration systems in China which restrict mobility. In particular, for skilled labor, the incentives of the main actors affecting the labor market militated against having a good supply of skilled labor into the labor market. So serf and slave owners are particularly unlikely to want to their skilled slaves and serfs to flee, and unlikely to, more likely to try to enforce their legal rights against these fugitives. Heads of extended families typically are thought to dissuade skilled family members from entering the wage labor market per Rosenthal and Wong. So we have less competitive labor markets, fewer people getting into the labor market in a way where they might be available for the Kremerian processes to operate on them. It's possible, of course, that labor could be perfectly assortatively matched by dictate, but we argue that rulers are probably not going to assortatively match workers as efficiently as a market. A good part of what they would want to do is allocate elites to optimize administration of the empire, which would mean allocating them to a widely dispersed set of administrative centers, or to optimize military performance, which would mean allocating elites to forts that are presumably dispersed along the border. So neither of those sounds like a recipe for optimizing economic performance in the same way that happens in the Kremer model. In order to take a look at what really is going on outside Europe, we have a lot of problems because the data are scarce. So our first crack at this was to take the Schick et al. Sample, which has pretty poor coverage outside Europe, but not vanishing coverage. And we expand the sample criteria, or loosen the criteria to expand the sample in a couple of ways. First, we drop the requirement that individuals die within 5 kilometers of a major city. So now all the elites who are born rural and die rural, or born in a city and die rural, are brought into the sample. That's a fairly big percentage in Europe, maybe, depending on the century, maybe 40%. And we're also going to bring in those dying in the first 50 years of the 19th century. So with those maneuvers, we substantially expand our sample in Western Europe. If you remember, it was about 4,500, and now it's 9,567. That was less important. What we were trying to do is get as many people outside Europe as possible. And if we cobble together Eastern Europe, the Islamic world, and China, we get a sample of 695. So what we're going to do with this sample is calculate sort of the change in creative potential, we'll call it. How much does a particular individual's birth to death migration increase the number of famous neighbors that they have? The size of a neighborhood, I think, is 100 kilometers, and we're going to normalize it by the number of famous neighbors at birth plus 1. So if this is a century in which everybody has a famous neighbor, we wouldn't have to do the plus 1 part. But roughly speaking, this is how much, as a percentage basis, how much do you increase your famous neighbors by your movements? Then we're going to regress this increase in creative potential for each creative person on their quality metric, and do that in a moving window across time. And the coefficient on quality is what we're going to report. So here's what the picture looks like for these 2 samples. In Western Europe, you can see that there's not any clear evidence of assortative matching by this metric until we hit roughly 1550, which I believe is the preceding century. So essentially, this is a post-printing revolution. The first post-printing revolution century is the first time that we get clear assortative matching by this metric. And it simply increases up to 1700 and then stabilizes for the rest of the time period. And in the not Western Europe side of things, we never get a significant amount of assortative matching. So an obvious worry about this particular analysis is that 695 individuals isn't enough. So we did resample from the Western part of the analysis, taking large numbers of samples of 695 and rerunning the analysis on each one of those randomly sampled subsamples. And you find in the West that you get the same basic picture. So it's not just a power problem. A sample of 695 is big enough to detect the kind of assortative matching you get in the West from 1600 on. So we also took a sort of a second tack and went back to looking at these Gini coefficients in Western and Eastern Europe only. And here we found another data set, which is significantly larger than Schick et al.'s and was conveniently coded by Delacroix and a co-author. And here we have 21,000 famous persons from Western Europe. And more importantly, we sort of double our sample size from the non-West, but here they're all from Eastern Europe. So we're going to again calculate a Gini coefficient based on the distribution of these famous individuals across the cities in their respective regions, this time without weighting by quality. A consequence of using this larger data set is not all of them have Wikipedia pages. And here's what you get when you look at this larger data set and again calculate this delta Gini coefficient. It looks pretty similar to the previous slide for Western Europe. And as you can see, for Eastern Europe, we don't get significant assortative matching or contributions of migration to inequality and the distribution of talent until 1800 in Eastern Europe. Looking at the substantive size, it's always smaller, even in 1600, 1700, and 1800, than it is in 1200, 1300, and 1400 in the West. So turning from individuals and where individuals go and how their birth to death migrations affect both their own productivity and the inequality of talent distribution across cities. Another part of the paper returns to this notion of apex cities. So by that, all we mean is that in Kremer's model, there has to be a top city in each O-ring sector. And under the model would predict that these cities, whatever they are high tech, high wage, and high growth places. So we use sort of the growth part of that to try to find these cities initially. So we identify apex cities as those that are above the 90th percentile in their region in both their own growth rate and in the rate of growth of urban potential. So urban potential is the spatial lag of other cities' growth rates. And our criteria is just that you're a fast-growing city in a cluster of fast-growing cities, essentially. And this particular metric really doesn't speak to whether these are top-down or patronage-driven cities or bottom-up cities that are growing fast because of mercantile effort. What we think is true is that these top-down or patronage apex cities are common throughout Eurasia, and it's really only the bottom-up apex cities that are expected under Kremer's model that are prevalent in the West. So here's the picture of how many apex cities there were and when in a whole series of Eurasian regions. The red diamonds are Western Europe, and you see that soon after the communal revolution, we have the West diverging from the rest of Eurasia. Prior to 1200, there's really nothing much to choose amongst the various regions. And Eastern Europe, the Islamic world, East Asia, and South Asia don't show a great deal of action. And when it does come in 1600 in East Asia, for example, it's not as consistent and well below the Western level. So we've got a lot more apex cities being more reliably produced. I should also mention that they persist more in the West. Apex cities can be pretty evanescent outside. In fact, none of them last more than a century. And under the Kremerian model, there are some substantial incentives to innovate in and around these apex cities. So first off, they should have high wages under Kremer's model. They do have high wages in the sense that our operationally identified apex cities match pretty well with Allen's real wage data. And these are the places that had high wages in Europe. And because of these high wages, we would expect an incentive to invent. Apex cities are also the places that under the model are where skilled mechanical workers and skilled researchers are being matched, and this should improve the capacity to invent. So sort of backing up, I think I may have forgot to mention earlier in the talk that we view both commodity sectors and knowledge sectors as O-ring sectors. So most sectors where what you're trying to produce is a new recipe or a new set of instructions using Romer's definition of technology, are going to involve a more or less long chain of steps which have to be completed competently in order to get a reasonably good product at the end. So mathematical proofs are the most obvious example where a single misstep is sort of fatal, but a good deal of R&D looks quite similar. So the general motivating idea, given at the the quote at the bottom there from Prack and Van Zanden, is that a combination of high wage levels and cluster effects is a fruitful place to look for explanations of technological productivity or innovativeness. So here's what the data look like. What are these data? Well, for China, this is Joseph Needham's data, which was compiled by some scholars. And then in Europe, it is a compilation of inventions by Hellemans and Bunch, which is, we think, fairly comparable to Needham. So the black circles are China. And as you can see, the left-hand side of the graph is really just comparing China to Europe. At this stage, the data haven't been sorted out into modern country borders, which happens in the right-hand side there. And China is substantially more innovative than Europe through to the 1300s and 1400s, almost to the 1400s. The data start bringing or split out in Europe into France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, and Britain starting in 1450. And after 1600, the width of the aggregation window changes from 100 years on the left to 50 years. So what you see in this picture is that the Dutch are, on a per capita per century basis, by far the most innovative in this particular data set. And they are very innovative precisely when our method identifies them as having most of the apex cities in Europe. And you see they do decline quite steeply. And then by the last period, they have no apex cities and aren't producing much in the way of inventions per capita. The British start off in the early part with no apex cities. They begin to gain them after the middle of the 17th century, and they sort of take over the apex city and the innovation gig by the end of the time series. Italy, which is the green diamonds, starts off in the Renaissance as a pretty innovative place, and then has a substantial decline post 1600. The Chinese in 950 are more innovative than any of the European countries were, including the Italian Renaissance, but still well short of the initial Dutch levels and the eventual British levels. So the picture here can be slightly pushed further just by regressing the per capita invention rate on country fixed effects, year fixed effects, and an indicator of total apex cities. We use a couple of different ones in this particular analysis, but it confirms the storyline that I was describing when looking at the graph, which is that controlling for country fixed effects and year fixed effects, if you've got more apex cities, you're producing more inventions per capita. So that brings me to a restatement of the thesis and a conclusion. After the communal revolution, certain parts of Western Europe developed unusually competitive markets for skilled labor and for the very upper tail human capital. And that led to significantly higher levels of assortative matching across cities that allowed the emergence of these apex cities at a much higher rate. That increased productivity, which is the Great Divergence, and internal inequality, which is the Little Divergence. And there's the picture again.